In the cloudy skies above wartime Germany, a damaged P-47 Thunderbolt sputtered and groaned, trailing smoke against the gray winter backdrop. By all accounts, this massive American fighter should have plummeted to the earth, its pilot injured, its engine failing, and enemy aircraft closing in. Yet, in that desperate moment, when the situation seemed hopeless, this remarkable aircraft would demonstrate why it earned the nickname Thunderbolt. It was a story that would become legend among the pilots of the 8th Air Force, a testament to American engineering and the indomitable spirit of the men who flew these flying tanks into battle against overwhelming odds. Before we dive into this extraordinary story, tell me in the comments, which city are you watching from? It's incredible to see our historical community spread across the world. And if you're new here, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Each subscription helps us continue unearthing these fascinating stories that shaped our world. Now let's get to the story. The genesis of the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt began years before its combat debut over Europe. In the late 1930s, as conflict loomed on the horizon, American aircraft designers were already considering the requirements for a new generation of fighters. Alexander Kartveli, Republic Aviation's chief designer, had initially conceived of a lightweight interceptor. But as reports filtered in from the early air battles over Europe, the design evolved dramatically. The lightweight concept was abandoned in favor of something altogether more substantial, a fighter that would combine speed, firepower, and most importantly, survivability. Kartveli's team found inspiration in an unlikely source: the U.S. Navy's requirement for aircraft that could withstand the punishment of carrier landings. This philosophy of rugged construction would prove prescient when the aircraft faced the challenging combat environment over Europe. When the prototype XP-47B first rolled out of Republic's Farmingdale, New York factory in May 1941, observers were struck by its sheer size. At a time when fighters were expected to be nimble and lightweight, the XP-47B was a behemoth, over 20 feet long, with a wingspan of 40 feet and weighing nearly 12,000 pounds fully loaded. Its most distinctive feature was the massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 double-wasp radial engine, an 18-cylinder monster producing 2,000 horsepower that required an equally massive four-bladed propeller to harness its power. This engine, combined with an innovative turbo supercharger system that maintained power at high altitudes, gave the Thunderbolt exceptional high-altitude performance, a critical advantage in the strategic bombing campaign that would unfold over Europe. But it was the aircraft's armament that truly set it apart. While contemporary fighters typically carried 4 or 6 machine guns, the Thunderbolt bristled with 8 .50-caliber Browning M2 machine guns, 4 in each wing, with a combined rate of fire of 800 rounds per minute. This impressive firepower could disable any opposing aircraft unfortunate enough to find itself in the Thunderbolt's gun sights. The early production P-47s began reaching the European theater of operations in late 1942, with the 56th Fighter Group being the first to receive them. The pilots' initial reactions were mixed. Having trained on the smaller, more nimble P-40s, many found the Thunderbolt to be unwieldy and unforgiving. Its sheer bulk earned it the nickname Jug, short for Juggernaut, though some pilots joked that it resembled a milk jug with wings. Colonel Hubert "Hub" Zemke, the commander of the 56th Fighter Group, was initially skeptical. "The thing looks like it should be hauling freight, not fighting," he reportedly quipped after his first inspection. But as pilots gained experience with the aircraft, they began to appreciate its virtues. The Thunderbolt could dive faster than any other Allied fighter, and its robust construction allowed it to sustain battle damage that would have doomed lighter aircraft. Lieutenant Colonel Francis "Gabby" Gabreski, who would become the top-scoring Thunderbolt ace of the war, initially disliked the aircraft, but changed his opinion after returning from a mission with over 300 bullet holes in his plane, yet with all systems functioning. "It's like flying a bathtub," he noted, "but a bathtub that can take a pounding and still bring you home. By early 1944, the air war over Europe had reached a critical turning point. The Allied strategic bombing campaign had been underway for years, but the cost in aircraft and crews had been staggering. The mighty B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators of the 8th Air Force were being shot down at an alarming rate. The opposing air forces, despite diminishing resources and fuel shortages, remained a lethal adversary. Their veteran pilots, many with hundreds of combat missions and dozens of victories to their credit, stalked the bomber formations with deadly precision. Something had to change, and that change came in the form of the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt. This massive fighter aircraft, nicknamed the Jug due to its bulky milk jug-like fuselage, was initially dismissed by many pilots who preferred the sleeker, more maneuverable P-51 Mustang. But the Thunderbolt possessed qualities that would soon make it a legend: unparalleled ruggedness, formidable firepower, and the ability to absorb punishment that would have destroyed any other aircraft in the Allied inventory. The P-47 was powered by the massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp radial engine, producing over 2,000 horsepower and driving a massive four-bladed propeller. This power plant gave the nearly 7-ton fighter surprising agility and a top speed exceeding 400 miles per hour. But the Thunderbolt's most significant advantage was its armament. 8 50-caliber Browning machine guns mounted in the wings, capable of firing 850 rounds per minute each. When all guns fired simultaneously, they could deliver over 100 rounds per second, enough to disable even the most heavily armored opposing aircraft. The aircraft's turbo-supercharger system was an engineering marvel in itself, allowing the engine to maintain full power at altitudes above 30,000 feet, where the thin air would cause conventional engines to lose much of their output. This system drew exhaust gases from the engine through ducts in the wings to power a turbine that compressed the incoming air, effectively turbocharging the massive radial engine. This complex system required careful management from pilots who had to monitor temperatures and pressures while simultaneously engaged in combat, but it gave the Thunderbolt a decisive edge in high-altitude engagements where many opposing fighters struggled to maintain power. The 56th Fighter Group, known as Zemke's Wolfpack after their commander, had developed into one of the most formidable fighter units in the European theater. Based at Boxted Airfield in Essex, England, the group had been flying the P-47 since its introduction to combat and had refined tactics that played to the aircraft's strengths. Rather than attempting to outturn the more nimble opposing fighters, a contest the heavy Thunderbolt would invariably lose, they relied on energy tactics, using the P-47's exceptional dive performance and high-speed handling to engage on favorable terms and then escape if the situation turned against them. Colonel Zemke, a tactically innovative commander, emphasized the importance of teamwork and situational awareness. "The lone wolf dies, but the pack survives," was his oft-repeated mantra. Each squadron within the group developed its own personality and reputation, but all shared a common pride in their aircraft and their mission. The 61st Fighter Squadron, known as Top Cover, the 62nd Ready Squadron, and the 63rd Fighting Squadron each contributed to the group's impressive tally of enemy aircraft destroyed. Captain James Razorback Thompson of the 56th Fighter Group had flown 37 combat missions in his P-47D, which he had named Missouri Mule after his home state. The nose art depicted a stubborn mule kicking a caricature of a dictator. Thompson had scored 4 confirmed victories, making him 1 victory short of the coveted ace status. His squadron, part of the legendary 56th Fighter Group commanded by Colonel Hubert "Hub" Zemke, had been tasked with escorting bombers deep into Germany. Thompson's path to the cockpit of a P-47 had been circuitous. A native of Springfield, Missouri, he had been studying engineering at the University of Missouri when Pearl Harbor was attacked. Like thousands of other young Americans, he immediately volunteered for service, initially hoping to join the Navy. However, his color vision, slightly deficient, but within the Air Corps' more lenient standards, directed him toward the Army Air Forces instead. After basic training, he was selected for pilot training, graduating from flight school in August 1942. His instructors noted his exceptional understanding of aircraft systems and mechanical aptitude, skills that would serve him well in the complex P-47. After advanced training in P-40 Warhawks, Thompson was assigned to the 56th Fighter Group, arriving in England in April 1943, just as the group was transitioning to combat operations. The date was February 22, 1944, and the target was the ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt. Previous raids on this vital industrial target had resulted in catastrophic losses, earning the mission the grim nickname Black Thursday. Now the 8th Air Force was returning, determined to disrupt this critical component of the opposing war machine. The strategic importance of Schweinfurt could hardly be overstated. The massive factories there produced over 40% of Germany's precision ball bearings, components essential for everything from aircraft engines to tank transmissions. Without these bearings, the opposing forces' mobility would be severely compromised. The leadership understood this vulnerability all too well and had concentrated formidable defenses around the target. Previous American bombing raids in August and October 1943 had resulted in staggering losses, 60 B-17s shot down and hundreds more damaged in a single mission. The October raid had been so costly that deep penetration missions had been temporarily suspended. But by February 1944, with improved fighter escort tactics and the longer-ranged P-51 Mustang entering service, the 8th Air Force was ready to try again. The raid would involve over 800 bombers escorted by every available fighter, including Thompson's 56th Fighter Group in their rugged Thunderbolts. The briefing room at Boxted Airfield in Essex, England, was somber as Colonel Zemke outlined the day's mission. "Gentlemen, today we're going back to Schweinfurt," he announced, his voice steady despite the significance of his words. A murmur rippled through the assembled pilots. Everyone knew the stories. Everyone understood what was at stake. "They know we're coming," Zemke continued, "and they'll throw everything they've got at us. Your job is simple. Protect those bombers at all costs." Thompson listened intently, studying the maps and noting the expected locations of opposing fighter bases and anti-aircraft concentrations. According to intelligence, the opposing forces had concentrated nearly 300 fighters in the area, including elite units equipped with the latest fighter variants. The pilots were desperate men defending their homeland with a ferocity born of desperation and fighting over territory where a bailout meant capture rather than death. Thompson and his fellow pilots understood the grim calculus. For every opposing fighter they failed to stop, American bomber crews would pay the price. The atmosphere in the briefing room was tense but focused. Veterans like Thompson knew the routine, checking maps, noting rally points, and memorizing emergency frequencies. For newer pilots, this would be their baptism by fire, a test of everything they had learned in training and from their more experienced squadron mates. The intelligence officer continued with the briefing, his pointer tracing the bomber route across the map of occupied Europe. Weather over the target is expected to be clear with a high cloud layer at 25,000 feet. Visibility should be excellent, which is good for our bombardiers, but also means the anti-aircraft batteries will have clear shots. He paused, allowing this sobering reality to sink in. Air response is expected to be extreme. They know the importance of Schweinfurt as well as we do. Expect encounters with several elite fighter wings. These elite fighter wings contained some of the opposing force's most experienced pilots. "Any questions?" asked Zemke after the intelligence briefing concluded. There were few. The mission was straightforward enough, and every man in the room understood what was expected of him. They would fly, they would fight, and they would do everything in their power to bring the bombers home. As dawn broke over the English countryside, a light drizzle fell from leaden skies. The weather was marginal for flying, not ideal, but not bad enough to cancel the mission. Thompson walked around his aircraft, performing his usual pre-flight inspection with methodical precision. The ground crew chief, Master Sergeant Frank Miller, had been with Thompson since his arrival in England. "She's ready to go, Captain," Miller assured him, patting the aircraft's fuselage affectionately. "Fresh oil, full ammo load, and I even fixed that sticky throttle." Thompson nodded appreciatively. The relationship between pilot and ground crew was sacred. His life depended on their meticulous work. Miller was a perfectionist who treated each P-47 under his care as if his own son were flying it. The 56th's ground crews took fierce pride in their aircraft, competing to maintain the highest serviceability rates among the fighter groups. This dedication translated directly into combat effectiveness. A fighter that remained grounded due to mechanical issues couldn't protect bombers or engage enemy aircraft. Climbing into the cockpit, Thompson settled into the familiar seat and began the startup procedure. The massive R-2800 engine coughed to life with a throaty roar, spewing blue smoke before settling into a smooth idle. All around the airfield, dozens of other Thunderbolts were starting up, their combined thunders shaking the ground. One by one, the heavily laden fighters taxied to the runway, warmed up, and took off in pairs. Soon, the entire 56th Fighter Group was airborne, climbing steadily through the overcast toward their rendezvous with the bomber stream. Thompson checked his oxygen mask, adjusted his goggles, and settled in for the long flight. Below them, the English Channel passed by, its gray waters occasionally visible through breaks in the clouds. Ahead lay occupied Europe and the heart of the conflict. Thompson found his thoughts wandering to his family back in Missouri, his parents who ran a hardware store in Springfield, his younger sister who was studying to be a nurse. He had received a letter from her just the previous day, full of news about home and gentle inquiries about his well-being. He had responded with the sanitized version of his experiences, emphasizing the camaraderie among his squadron mates and downplaying the dangers he faced daily. It was a dance all combat pilots performed with their loved ones back home, providing reassurance without revealing too much of the harsh reality. The bomber formation came into view at 22,000 feet. Hundreds of B-17s and B-24s arranged in tight combat boxes, their contrails etching white lines across the blue-black sky. Thompson and his squadron took a position on the right flank of the formation, scanning the horizon for the inevitable response. It wasn't long in coming. "Bandits, 12 o'clock high!" The radio crackled with the warning from one of the lead pilots. Thompson looked up to see the unmistakable silhouettes of enemy fighters, at least 20 diving from above, the sun glinting off their canopies. "Blue section, climb and intercept," ordered the squadron leader. Thompson pushed his throttle forward, feeling the surge of power as the Thunderbolt's nose rose toward the incoming threat. The P-47 might not climb as quickly as the opposing fighters, but once at altitude, it could dive like nothing else in the sky. Thompson's heart rate accelerated, but his movements remained precise, the product of training and experience. He positioned himself slightly behind and below his section leader, maintaining the tactical formation they had drilled countless times. His eyes scanned continuously, watching not only the approaching enemy but also checking his 6 o'clock position, aware that opposing tactics often included a high group to occupy attention while another group attacked from behind or below. The first pass happened with shocking speed. The enemy fighters screamed through the formation, guns blazing, while the American pilots broke formation to engage. The sky became a chaotic three-dimensional battlefield, with aircraft twisting and turning in a deadly aerial ballet. Thompson found himself behind an opposing fighter, its distinctive yellow painted tail marking it as part of an elite unit. He squeezed the trigger, and his 8 Brownings roared to life. Tracers streaked toward the fighter, connecting with its right wing. Pieces of aluminum flew off, but the aircraft rolled hard and dove away, trailing a thin wisp of smoke, but still very much in the fight. Thompson followed, utilizing the P-47's exceptional diving capabilities to stay with his quarry. The opposing pilot was skilled, using his aircraft's superior roll rate to prevent Thompson from getting a solid deflection shot. The two fighters spiraled downward, each pilot trying to maneuver into an advantageous position. Thompson's altitude indicator unwound rapidly, 22,000 feet, 18,000, 15,000, as the aerial duel descended toward the cloud layer below. He knew he couldn't follow the fighter too far from the bomber formation. That was exactly what the opposing forces wanted, to draw off the escorts and leave the bombers vulnerable. The battle spread out across miles of sky as more enemy fighters arrived. Thompson had become separated from his wingman during the initial engagement and was now flying alone, a dangerous situation in combat. Scanning constantly, he spotted another P-47 nearby and moved to join up. Before he could reach the other Thunderbolt, his aircraft shuddered violently. Orange flashes erupted from his right wing, and warning lights illuminated across his instrument panel. He'd been hit, likely by a fighter that had approached from his blind spot. The engine began to run rough, and the aircraft started to lose altitude. Thompson keyed his radio. Blue 4 is hit, losing power. He fought to keep the wounded Thunderbolt level, assessing the damage. The temperature gauge was climbing rapidly into the red, and oil pressure was dropping, classic signs of a damaged engine. Worse, the right wing had taken multiple cannon hits, and fuel was streaming from ruptured tanks. In a lighter aircraft, these would have been fatal wounds, but the P-47 was notorious for its ability to absorb punishment. Thompson had heard stories of Thunderbolts returning to base with hundreds of holes, missing parts of their control surfaces, even with cylinders shot out of their engines. Now he would find out if those stories were exaggerated. The engineering that went into the P-47's ruggedness wasn't accidental. Alexander Kartveli and his team at Republic Aviation had deliberately designed the Thunderbolt to withstand extraordinary punishment. The massive radial engine was inherently more resistant to battle damage than liquid-cooled inline engines. Where a single bullet through a coolant line could doom a P-51 Mustang or a Spitfire, the air-cooled R-2800 could continue running even with several cylinders damaged. The cockpit was surrounded by armor plate, protecting the pilot from all but direct hits. Fuel tanks were self-sealing, designed to close up around bullet holes. Control surfaces featured redundant systems, allowing the aircraft to remain controllable even after significant damage. All of these features were being tested now as Thompson's damaged Thunderbolt struggled to maintain altitude. The aircraft had been hit in multiple critical areas. The engine cowling was riddled with holes, the right wing's leading edge was torn open, and the distinctive sound of the massive radial engine had changed from a smooth roar to an irregular, coughing rumble. Yet it was still flying, still responding to the controls, still giving Thompson a fighting chance. An enemy fighter, a formidable FW-190, came around for another pass. Thompson could see the distinctive markings on its fuselage as it closed in, its 20mm cannons ready to finish the job. In that crucial moment, Thompson made a decision that contradicted conventional wisdom. Instead of diving away from the threat, he turned toward it. The damaged P-47 groaned under the strain as he hauled it around, lining up the approaching fighter in his gun sight. The opposing pilot, likely expecting the damaged American to flee, seemed momentarily surprised by this aggressive move. That hesitation cost him dearly. Thompson squeezed the trigger, and all 8 machine guns opened up in a thunderous response. The barrage of .50 caliber bullets tore into the FW-190's engine and cockpit. The fighter erupted in flames and rolled inverted, plummeting toward the earth. There was no parachute. Thompson had scored his 5th victory, officially becoming an ace, but his situation remained dire. His altitude was now 18,000 feet and dropping steadily. The engine was overheating catastrophically, and the control stick was becoming sluggish. His options were limited. Try to reach friendly territory, which seemed impossible given his aircraft's condition, bail out over enemy territory, and face capture, or attempt a crash landing in hostile countryside. The P-47's cockpit was now filling with smoke, and Thompson had to crack the canopy open to see and breathe. The frigid high-altitude air rushed in, a shocking contrast to the heat from the failing engine. He quickly calculated his position and prospects. The battle had carried him deep into enemy airspace, far from any possibility of reaching Allied lines. The Rhine River lay between him and friendly territory, and in his aircraft's condition, it might as well have been the Atlantic Ocean. Meanwhile, the temperature gauge continued to climb, and warning lights illuminated across the instrument panel. The hydraulic pressure was dropping, suggesting battle damage to those systems as well. Soon, he would lose control surface effectiveness entirely. The radio crackled again. "Blue 4, this is Red Leader. What's your status?" It was Major Robert Johnson, one of the group's highest-scoring aces. Thompson replied through gritted teeth, "Engine shot, losing altitude. Don't think I'll make it back." "What's your position?" Johnson asked. Thompson gave his coordinates, somewhere over central Germany. "Hang in there, Jim," Johnson responded. "We'll get the rescue boys looking for you." Thompson appreciated the sentiment, but knew the reality. Air-sea rescue operated primarily over the Channel. Deep in enemy territory, his chances of rescue were virtually non-existent. Now at 15,000 feet, Thompson spotted movement to his left. Two more opposing fighters had spotted his vulnerable aircraft and were closing in. With his aircraft damaged, Thompson couldn't outrun or outmaneuver them. But the Thunderbolt had one more advantage to offer. Even with a failing engine, its exceptional dive capabilities remained. Thompson rolled the aircraft and pushed the stick forward, entering a steep dive. The airspeed indicator climbed rapidly, 300, 350, 400 miles per hour. The damaged engine screamed in protest, but the sheer weight of the P-47 accelerated it beyond the pursuing fighter's ability to follow. They broke off their attack, unwilling to risk structural failure at such speeds. Thompson had bought himself some time, but at a cost. When he tried to pull out of the dive, the control stick felt like it was set in concrete. Something was wrong with the hydraulic system, likely damaged in the initial attack. Using all his strength, he managed to arrest the dive at 8,000 feet, but the effort left him drenched in sweat and breathing heavily. The engine was now belching black smoke, and the temperature gauge had pegged at its maximum reading. Oil streaked back from the cowling, coating the windscreen and reducing visibility. Thompson knew the engine would seize completely within minutes. Looking down, he spotted a cluster of buildings that appeared to be an airfield. Despite his predicament, a daring plan formed in his mind. If he was going down, he would take action that would impact the opposing force's ability to launch aircraft against the bombers he had been tasked to protect. With nothing to lose, Thompson aimed his crippled Thunderbolt toward the airfield. As he descended, he could see aircraft parked in neat rows, a mixture of fighters and bombers. Ground crews scattered as the smoking American fighter approached. Anti-aircraft guns opened fire, adding to the damage already sustained by the P-47. But Thompson pressed on, lining up for a strafing run across the parked aircraft. At 2,000 feet, he squeezed the trigger one last time. The 850 caliber machine guns roared to life, directing concentrated fire across the airfield. The rounds found their targets among the parked planes, igniting fuel tanks and setting off secondary explosions. Pillars of smoke rose from the airfield as Thompson held down the trigger, his guns continuing until the ammunition was exhausted. The ground defenses continued to return fire, and more hits registered on his already battered aircraft. The engine finally seized completely with a terrible grinding sound. The propeller windmilled to a stop, leaving Thompson in eerie silence, except for the rush of wind and the occasional impact of rounds finding their mark. With the engine dead, the P-47 began to lose altitude rapidly. Thompson was committed now. He couldn't bail out this low over an enemy airfield where his reception would be anything but friendly. His only option was to attempt a crash landing. He spotted a relatively flat field beyond the airfield perimeter and aimed for it, trying to maintain enough airspeed to keep the controls effective. The ground rushed up to meet him as he lowered the landing gear, unsure if it would even deploy given the damage. To his surprise, the gear extended and locked. Perhaps he could pull off a survivable landing after all. The wheels touched down, and for a brief moment Thompson thought he might roll to a safe stop. Then the right gear, weakened by battle damage, collapsed under the strain. The massive fighter slewed sideways, digging a wing into the soft earth. The world spun as the P-47 cartwheeled across the field, shedding parts with each impact. When the motion finally stopped, Thompson hung upside down in his harness, dazed but alive. He had a cut on his forehead, and his left arm hung at an unnatural angle, clearly broken. But considering what he'd just been through, his injuries were remarkably minor, another testament to the Thunderbolt's protective cockpit design. Through the shattered canopy, he could see soldiers approaching cautiously, weapons drawn. His combat role was over, but not before he had achieved ace status and struck a significant blow against the opposing force's air capabilities. The soldiers who captured Thompson were ground troops assigned to airfield defense. They approached the wrecked P-47 with weapons ready, unsure if the pilot would resist. Thompson, still hanging upside down in his harness, raised his good arm in surrender. The sergeant in charge gave orders, and 2 privates helped extract Thompson from the cockpit. The pain from his broken arm was excruciating, but he maintained his composure, remembering his training on how to conduct himself if captured. Name, rank, and serial number. Nothing more. The captors, for their part, treated him correctly. A medic was summoned who splinted his broken arm and dressed the cut on his forehead. Thompson was then loaded into a truck and driven to the airfield headquarters for preliminary questioning. The interrogation room was sparse, a wooden table, 3 chairs, and a single hanging light bulb. Thompson sat stoically as an intelligence officer attempted to extract information from him. "Your comrades will be concerned about you, Captain Thompson," the officer said in perfect English. "Perhaps you'd like to record a message for your squadron, letting them know you're alive?" Thompson refused, giving only his name, rank, and serial number. The intelligence officer smiled thinly. "We already know a great deal about you and your squadron, Captain. The 56th Fighter Group, based at Boxted. Colonel Zemke's command. You fly the P-47D, an impressive aircraft, though not as maneuverable as our Focke-Wulfs." Thompson remained silent, unsurprised by the officer's knowledge. Intelligence on both sides was thorough. After several fruitless hours, Thompson was transported under guard to a collection center for downed Allied airmen. There he joined other captured pilots, mostly Americans and British, with a few Canadians and Free French. The Allied pilots maintained a careful distance from one another at first, suspicious of potential infiltrators among them. But as they exchanged coded references to bases and units, they gradually established trust. From the collection center, Thompson and the other captured airmen were loaded onto a train bound for the permanent POW camp where they would spend the remainder of the conflict. The journey took 3 days, during which the prisoners were given minimal food and water. The train made frequent stops and detours to avoid Allied bombing. At one point, their own aircraft, P-47s from Thompson's very squadron, strafed the rail yard where their train was temporarily stopped, unaware that Allied prisoners were aboard. The irony was not lost on Thompson, who had performed similar attacks on enemy transport countless times. Thompson spent the remainder of the war in Stalag Luft III, the prisoner of war camp made famous by the Great Escape. There he learned that his final act of defiance had disabled 9 aircraft on the ground and damaged numerous others, making it one of the most successful single aircraft actions of the war. This information came from a newly captured pilot who had heard the story from the 56th Fighter Group's intelligence officers. Thompson's status as a prisoner of war was initially difficult to accept for a man accustomed to action and freedom. But like most of his fellow captives, he adapted to the routine of camp life. The camp was divided into compounds by nationality, with American officers housed separately from enlisted men and other Allied troops. The barracks were Spartan but adequate, triple-tiered bunks, a central stove for heat, and minimal furniture. Food consisted primarily of black bread, thin soup, and occasional Red Cross parcels that provided vital supplements like coffee, chocolate, and canned meat. Thompson's broken arm healed improperly due to inadequate medical care, leaving him with limited mobility in that limb for the rest of his life. But he considered himself fortunate compared to many others. Life in Stalag Luft III was a mixture of tedium and tension. The prisoners organized elaborate entertainment, theatrical productions, musical concerts, sports leagues, and educational courses taught by prisoners with expertise in various fields. Thompson attended classes in German and engineering, thinking ahead to the post-war world. But beneath the surface, normality ran an undercurrent of resistance. Escape committees operated in secret, planning and executing breakout attempts. The most famous of these, the Great Escape of March 1944, had occurred just before Thompson's arrival at the camp. The consequences of this event had sobered the camp's attitude toward escapes, but planning continued nonetheless. Thompson contributed to these efforts with his engineering background, helping to design improvements to tunnel ventilation systems. He never attempted escape himself, partly due to his injured arm, but primarily because he recognized that the war was gradually turning in the Allies' favor. By late 1944, the distant thunder of artillery could occasionally be heard from the Eastern Front, signaling the approach of the Soviet Army. The Guards, once strict, became increasingly nervous as their inevitable defeat approached. Rations deteriorated further as the opposing forces' logistics system collapsed under the weight of Allied bombing. After liberation in 1945, Thompson returned home to Missouri, his experiences forever etched in his memory. The story of his final mission spread throughout the 8th Air Force, becoming part of the P-47's legendary reputation. The Missouri Mule had lived up to both its name and the Thunderbolt's reputation for toughness. Reintegration into civilian life presented its own challenges. Like many returning veterans, Thompson found that friends and family, though well-meaning, couldn't truly understand what he had experienced. The America he returned to had changed as well, more prosperous, more confident, and poised to become a global leader. Using the GI Bill, Thompson completed his engineering degree at the University of Missouri, though his injured arm prevented him from pursuing the hands-on mechanical work he had once envisioned. Instead, he gravitated toward management positions, eventually becoming a production supervisor at a manufacturing firm in Kansas City. He married his college sweetheart, Eleanor, in 1947, and they raised 3 children together. On the surface, his life resembled that of millions of other World War II veterans: a modest home in the suburbs, a steady job, family vacations in a Chevrolet station wagon. But the war remained with him, emerging in nightmares and in a startled response that never fully faded. In the decades following the war, the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt would be overshadowed in popular culture by the sleeker, more photogenic P-51 Mustang. But among those who flew and fought in them, the Jug would always hold a special place. Its ability to absorb punishment and bring pilots home, or in Thompson's case, to strike a final blow even when beyond hope, made it unique among fighter aircraft. By the end of the war, P-47s had flown more than 546,000 combat sorties, disabled over 7,000 enemy aircraft, 3,152 in the air, and delivered more than 132,000 tons of ordnance, a testament to its versatility as both air superiority fighter and ground attack aircraft. The P-47's ground attack capabilities, initially secondary to its role as a high-altitude escort fighter, became increasingly important as the Allies gained air superiority. Armed with bombs and rockets in addition to its formidable battery of machine guns, the Thunderbolt became a formidable presence for opposing ground forces. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel himself noted in his papers the significant impact of fighter-bomber attacks on mobility, writing that movement during daylight had become virtually impossible due to Allied air power, with the P-47 being particularly respected. After the war, Captain Thompson rarely spoke about his experiences. Like many of his generation, he returned home, started a family, and built a quiet life away from the chaos of war. When asked about his extraordinary final mission, he would typically downplay his actions, attributing his survival to good engineering and a whole lot of luck. In 1969, 25 years after his capture, Thompson received a surprising letter from Germany. It was from Hans Müller, a former ground crewman who had been present during Thompson's attack on the airfield. Müller described the events of that day, but there was no bitterness in his words, only respect for a fellow airman who had displayed exceptional courage. The two men began a correspondence that lasted until Thompson's death in 1987. Their friendship symbolized the reconciliation between former adversaries that characterized the post-war era, a reminder that beneath the national insignia painted on their aircraft, they were all aviators bound by a common experience of the sky. Müller visited America in 1975, staying with Thompson and his family for 2 weeks. The two former opponents toured air museums together, examining the preserved examples of the aircraft they had once maintained and flown. Their conversations often drifted into technical details that bewildered Thompson's family, discussions of supercharger settings, ammunition feed systems, and the quirks of radial engines. But beneath the technical talk lay a deeper understanding of duty, of sacrifice, and of the strange bonds formed across former battle lines by those who had experienced the aerial war firsthand. Thompson's damaged P-47 was eventually recovered and studied to better understand American aircraft design. Parts of it reportedly ended up in aircraft research facilities where engineers marveled at the ruggedness of its construction, information that came too late to influence the outcome of the air war. The Thunderbolt's design principles would, however, influence post-war aircraft development worldwide. The emphasis on pilot protection and systems redundancy would become standard features in military aircraft design. The P-47's turbo supercharger system, revolutionary for its time, pointed the way toward the turbine engines that would power the jet age. And its multi-gun armament concept would find expression in the Gatling-style rotary cannons of later fighter aircraft. In this way, the technological DNA of the Thunderbolt lived on, even as the aircraft itself was gradually retired from service. The last Thunderbolts flown by the U.S. Air Force were phased out shortly after the war, replaced by jet fighters like the F-80 Shooting Star and F-84 Thunderjet. But the aircraft found a second life in the air forces of other nations, many of which received surplus P-47s through various aid programs. The legacy of the P-47 Thunderbolt continued long after the conflict ended. The aircraft served with distinction in multiple air forces around the world, including those of Brazil, Mexico, and Turkey, well into the 1950s. The Brazilian Air Force used P-47s in operations until 1954, while the Peruvian Air Force maintained operational Thunderbolts until 1966, an incredible testament to the design's durability and relevance. In many of these countries, the Thunderbolt provided a first taste of modern air power, serving as a backbone for developing air forces until jet aircraft became widely available. Its design principles, particularly its emphasis on pilot protection and structural strength, influenced generations of American fighter aircraft. Modern close air support aircraft like the A-10 Thunderbolt II, named in honor of its World War II predecessor, carry on the P-47's legacy of ruggedness and survivability. The A-10, with its titanium bathtub protecting the pilot and ability to fly with significant battle damage, is in many ways the spiritual descendant of the P-47, designed for the same role of providing formidable firepower in support of ground troops while ensuring the pilot's safe return. The last operational P-47s were retired from the Peruvian Air Force in 1966, marking the end of its service career. Today, approximately 15 airworthy Thunderbolts remain, lovingly restored and maintained by museums and private collectors. When these magnificent machines appear at air shows, their distinctive rumble serves as a living reminder of the aircraft that helped secure Allied air superiority over Europe. The P-47's contribution to victory in World War II cannot be overstated. While strategic bombing disrupted opposing industry and the P-51 Mustang provided the range needed to escort bombers deep into enemy territory, it was the Thunderbolt that gave American pilots the confidence to engage enemy fighters on equal terms. Knowing their aircraft could sustain battle damage and still bring them home allowed P-47 pilots to press attacks aggressively, gradually wearing down the opposing fighter force through attrition. The psychological impact of this cannot be understated. Enemy pilots came to respect the Thunderbolt not only for its firepower, but for its seemingly supernatural ability to absorb punishment and keep flying. This reputation was earned through countless combats where P-47s, riddled with holes and trailing smoke, nevertheless managed to return to their bases. For the men who flew the P-47, like Captain James Thompson, the aircraft was more than just a machine. It was a trusted partner, a protector, and sometimes a savior. The bond between fighter pilots and their aircraft has always been intimate, but the Thunderbolt inspired a particular kind of loyalty. As one pilot famously put it, "If you want to get home, fly a Mustang. If you want to get there even after being shot to pieces, fly a Jug." This sentiment was echoed in countless letters home, diary entries, and post-mission reports. Pilots would often pat the fuselage of their aircraft after a successful return, a silent acknowledgement of the partnership that had once again proven successful. Ground crews, too, developed deep attachments to the aircraft they maintained, taking fierce pride in their P-47s and the pilots who flew them. This relationship between man and machine was central to the air war, a contrast to the impersonal nature of much modern warfare, where remote systems and standoff weapons have replaced direct combat. The story of Captain Thompson and his final mission with Missouri Mule encapsulates everything that made the P-47 legendary: its ability to absorb punishment that would have destroyed lesser aircraft, its formidable firepower, and the courage of the men who flew it into battle. In that desperate moment over Europe, when all seemed lost, the massive American fighter had proven its worth, living up to its nickname of Thunderbolt. It was not merely an aircraft, but a symbol of American industrial might and fighting spirit, a 7-ton testament to the principle that in challenging circumstances, it's not how hard you're hit that matters, but whether you can persevere when all hope seems lost. As we reflect on these events from the vantage point of history, we're reminded that behind every aircraft, every victory, and every defeat were human beings caught in the maelstrom of the most destructive conflict in human history. The story of the P-47 Thunderbolt is ultimately the story of the men who designed it, built it, maintained it, and flew it into battle. Men like Captain James Thompson, whose courage in the face of overwhelming odds exemplifies the spirit that carried the Allies to victory. Perhaps that is the most important legacy of the Jug, not the adversaries it confronted, but the pilots it brought home to tell their tales.